thank you for coming to see how to steal $1 billion Wall Street frauds that made America. Do you hear me in the back?
Yes. Yes.
Brilliant. It's a fraud that made America, and boy, is there a lot of fraud to get through. In fact, over 400 years of fraud. So even the actual founding of the discovery and founding of Manhattan, where Wall Street exists, is arguably a result of a fraud. Now, technically, New York, Manhattan area was discovered in the 16th century by an Italian explorer called Giovanni da Verrazzano. But he very sensibly hushed it up, and obviously everyone else had done so, it would be yes, fraud. The person who's really credited with discovery is a guy called Henry Hudson. Now, Henry Hudson discovered New York while searching for a northeastern passage via the Russian Arctic from Europe to Asia. And you may think there's something wrong with that. After all, America isn't in the Russian Arctic. The only one person I think who confused America and Russia, and he isn't here today, is the Are You Donald? But actually, the big thing in the 16th and the early 17th century was the idea of trying to find a northeastern passage, a route that ironically is now becoming viable thanks to global warming, melting the ice. But actually, Henry Hudson, everyone who got it wrong. He thought the best route wasn't via the northeastern passage via the Russian Arctic, it was actually a northwestern passage via what we know today as a Canadian Arctic. The problem is, no one would fund them. Even after 2 failed expeditions to find a northeastern passage, he went to the Dutch asking for funding to find a northwestern passage. And the Dutch said, no, we're only going to fund another attempt to find a northeastern passage. So he did what all good entrepreneurs do. He took their money, then did what he wanted to do anyway. In which case, in that case, taking a short detour, a 3,000-mile detour. In 1609, his expedition hit what was now known as the Hudson River. He actually sailed up the Hudson River, thinking he'd found the northwestern passage, or he realized it hit a dead end. But he did find the island of Manhattan and modern-day New York. The next year, he finally managed to find the Canadian Arctic, and fortunately, after about 2 or 3 weeks of Arctic weather, and pretty much sick of him by this point, his crew seized him one morning and bundled him and his son into a small boat, giving him 5 days' worth of provisions. He said, you want to find the northwestern passage? Why don't you go ahead, we're going back to England. Now, I thought this was a great touch. Amateurs would simply have forced him to walk the plank there and then. They actually gave him 5 days' worth of provisions, which meant in 5 days to contemplate impending death. Anyway, needless to say, he wasn't, no nutrition was ever discovered. The mutineers went back to England, where they were promptly arrested and thrown in the Tower of Guns. The problem was, in those days, mutiny was rather frowned upon. You understand, it was kind of guiding principles for maritime nations. You can't really run an effective merchant navy of people who are mutineering all the time. And so the mutineers, they were going to be sentenced to death. How they come up with quite together. They claimed to have actually found the northwestern passage, and they said, if you execute us, you'll never know where it is. So that presented the English with a dilemma. Do we uphold centuries of maritime tradition and maritime law, or do we try and steal a march on our competitors? You can probably guess what the answer to that was. And so they actually went from being in the Tower of London at the King's pleasure, they were released, and a few days later they were actually dining with King James I. So they needed to say they didn't actually bother to do any more exploring, they just basically spent the rest of their lives making lots of money from credulous investors who were trying to raise money for future expeditions. But anyway, people did pay attention, and those people were the Dutch. And in 1621, the Dutch West India Company sent an expedition of colonists to colonize the Manhattan, New York area. And a few years later, they actually appointed the first governor, Peter Minuet. Peter Minuet was a lawyer, and lawyers actually everything on paper. So he felt actually the best thing to do would be to get the legal title to the island of Manhattan and the surrounding area. And he went to what he thought was the local tribe, and then actually a letter of him saying, I have bought the island of Manhattan and the surrounding area for goods and trinkets worth 16 gulden, or in other terms, $24. Traditionally, up until recently, this is an example of how the European settlers took advantage of the Native Americans who didn't really understand property rights, who were essentially the nomadic people. But recently, people begin to think that the Dutch are the ones who were conned. There was a complicated way to explain it, and two simpler ways. I'm going to start with a complicated way. The complicated way is the value of all land in Manhattan today is worth roughly $2 trillion. Turning $24 into $2 trillion sounds impressive, but over 400 years, that works out at about, in real terms, after inflation, 5% a year, which is probably impressive, but yes, you actually get from the stock market. But actually, the better way to, the simpler way to show how the Dutch were conned was the fact they actually, historians reckon, they actually bought the land from the wrong tribe. They bought the land from actually the tribe that didn't own the land. There was another tribe that kind of did spend all their time grazing their cattle in their area. They actually bought it from the wrong tribe. And imagine that you buy the land from what you think is the right tribe. You spend 400 years building it up, and you have to give it back because you bought it from the wrong people. But actually, the real reason why the Dutch got conned was because there was another tribe. These people were genuinely savage. They didn't respect property rights at all. And of course, these tribes were the English. So in 1671, the English had several colonies in the area, in New England. So they said, that's a nice piece of land, why don't we take it? And they actually sailed up 4 frigates up to the island of Manhattan, and they turned New Amsterdam into what would become New York. And they were aided and abetted by many of the Dutch settlers who at this time were thoroughly sick of all this interference from the Dutch West India Company. In fact, there was a long-standing feud between the settlers and the government, who was Peter ironically, Peter Minuet, the previous governor, was actually also fought by the settlers because shortly after he bought the land, another of the settlers came across, and there was amongst them was a guy called Reverend Jonas Michaelis. Now, Michaelis had a pretty rough voyage. In fact, his wife and his daughter died, so he wasn't in the best mood. So instead of leaving a negative review on TripAdvisor, he started writing letters back to Holland saying, this colony is an absolute shambles, the people there are impious, they're bawdy, and more importantly, the governor is stealing money from you. And the Dutch West India Company settled the dispute by recalling both Peter Minuet and the Reverend Jonas Michaelis, and they made them share a cabin for the voyage. But actually, I thought it was a really good way of settling the dispute. It's a 6-week journey, a very rough voyage, and they were confined to a small cabin. So there was quite a long history of antagonism between the settlers and their governors. So going back to 1671, when the English seized Manhattan, we didn't meet much resistance. So that is how New Amsterdam was founded and how New Amsterdam became New York. Right, the second one is the reason why I called this show How to Steal a Billion. My previous show last year was called How to Steal a Million. But the problem was last year's show focused on fraud in Britain, and this show focused on fraud in America. And of course, we all know that things are bigger in America. And one thing that is bigger is protests. I mean, I went on the 2019 Brexit protest, and an actual person with a placard who actually said, I am a British person, I'm on a protest, things must be bad, stop Brexit, please. Now, really nice touch. And think about the kind of capital riots, you know, the QAnon shame, and I don't think please was in his vocabulary somehow. So it does show you America, when it comes to protests, America's have much bigger and you know, much bigger, more successful protests. And one of the, of course, most famous protests is the Boston Tea Party. Now, of course, you could, I know that 15 years ago there wasn't a protest called the Tea Party, but I don't think it wasn't really a proper Tea Party protest because, let's face it, you tried to hold the Tea Party Day in Boston, you had to call it the no-fat, soy milk, hold the cinnamon latte protests. So actually the one person who actually incidentally led the protest indirectly was a person called Alexander Ford Dyce. Now he was actually born in Aberdeen in 1729. Initially he started off as a hosier, which means making socks, garters, stockings. Then he decided to take the low road down to London to seek his fortune. He started off as a clerk in a bank, and he was kind of a self-made man. He worked his way up until he was the actual partner in a private bank called the Neil Fordyce and Down. And he actually, in 1762, he made the bet or speculation that would change his life. By 1762, Europe had been at war for 7 years. It was called the 7 Years' War. It was a very disruptive war, and he got wind a treaty was about to be signed ending that war. And he managed to actually, he thought this would be great news for shares and great news for bonds. So he basically persuaded his partners to put all the bank's money on buying bonds, on buying shares, and that their price would go up. And indeed it did, and he made a fortune. In fact, actually, he was rich enough, he was actually known as the macaroni gambler. And if you ever heard the poem Yankee Doodle Dandy, he stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. Macaroni was slang for someone who had more money. You can send someone who was rich, who spent money on clothes, horses. Fordyce actually married the daughter of an earl. He had a big house, and he, of course, did what every person with more money than sense did. He decided to go into politics. He, in fact, tried to become the MP for Colchester. In 1768, he spent £14,000 on trying to become MP for Colchester, and this was actually roughly 2 million in today's money. And he actually lost, and it was amazing because he spent the equivalent of £2 million, and there were only 1,500 voters. So what did he do wrong? Well, the problem was he tried to appeal to their idealism, to their piety. He built a hospital, he built a chapel. His opponents resorted to the time-honoured strategy of taking them out for a meal on election day, getting them blind, drunk, and then pointing them in the direction of where the voting was taking place. You can judge, probably guess which one was more effective. Anyway, he wasn't undaunted, and unfortunately he got a bit carried away. If you know any speculators, once they have one success, they begin to think that they know everything, and so he decided to make another massive bet. This time he decided to do what's known as short selling, which means basically selling shares you don't own in the hope that you can buy them back. It's basically betting on the price of the shares falling. He decided to bet on the shares of none other than the East India Company. The East India Company was most likely Amazon, Apple, and Tesla all rolled into one. It had made a huge fortune, having exclusive right to import tea from India. It made huge amounts of money. In effect, it was basically his own kind of private government. But Amazon and Fordyce thought it was overvalued, that it wasn't actually as financially stable as it made out to be, and so we decided to short it. Unfortunately, the shares, rather than going down, they actually went up, and he started to lose money. So what did he do? He decided to actually short more shares, increase his position, and the shares kept going up, and as he lost his management, pretty soon he burnt through his own money, he burnt through his partner's money at the bank. He then started taking money, embezzling money from depositors, embezzling money from bondholders. In desperation, he actually went to an old friend, and his old friend said to him, what I thought was quite a good quote, "Son, I've had many friends ruined by betting on 2 dice. I'm not going to ruin myself by betting on 4 dice." Sounds great as they work now. So actually, he decides he's eyeballs in debt. He's bankrupt. His bank is bankrupt. He's embezzled money. What do you do? Well, he decides. He famously recounts. He wrote, "I always told wary ones and the wise ones with heads of a chicken and claws of a crow that I will be a man or a mouse. And this night the die is cast and I am a man. Bring me champagne, bring me burgundy. Tonight Alexander is a man, I live forever." And of course, the day after he sobered up, he actually decided to scamper to France. But this presented a huge problem. Not only was his bank bankrupt, but actually people who had deposited money with him and banks who had deposited money with his bank had also lost their money. This set in chain a huge banking crisis. It gave bankruptcy to banks in London, run on banks in Scotland, and obviously then also run on banks as far as Amsterdam. 22 banks went bankrupt because of him. And this presented a huge problem for both the East India Company and the British government, because if the East India Company wasn't in problems before, it was then, because there's financial chaos, people aren't buying tea, and the problem is the East India Company is too big to fail, but it's too big for the government to beg at. So they pick on what they think is a brilliant scheme. Up until then, the East India Company couldn't sell tea to America. It had to sell the tea to Britain, and then American tea merchants or smugglers would import it to America. And this obviously cost the company lost a lot of money. And so the British government said, we're going to allow you to sell tea directly to America, but we'll only take a small portion of that in tax. And they thought this would be a win-win. The East India Company would make money, the British government wouldn't need to bail them out, and they'd take a small amount in taxes, and the American consumer would get cheaper tea. Of course, the one people who didn't win were the American tea merchants. And historians have worked out that people who actually financed the Boston Tea Party were actually mostly tea merchants. So there came to about two powerful East India Company, no taxation representation, but it was actually more about trying to protect their livelihoods. And of course, after the Tea Party, the tea being dumped in Massachusetts Harbour, the government of Massachusetts clamped down on it. This led to inspire more protests, led to more repression, and very soon America declared independence. So that is how Alexander Fordyce caused Britain to lose America. But actually, I don't think he did. I think it was the other way around, because obviously, think about it, America and Britain had remained together, then obviously over time America was larger population, larger economy, and would become the dominant partner. So we would ended up being ruled by a sexually dysfunctional former New Yorker with bad hair called Donald. Except of course we were actually for 3 years run by a sexually dysfunctional former New Yorker red hair called Boris. So I don't know if that's an improvement or not. Incidentally, ironically, Alexander Fordyce, now you might think this being the 18th century, embezzling money, committing fraud, would be viewed badly by the authorities. And in fact, a year before all this, Alexander Fordyce was mugged by a group of highwaymen. They stole his watch, and the highwaymen were caught and they were hanged. So you think he might get punished, but actually he managed to go back, sneak back when things died down, sneak back to London, and negotiate with his creditors. He actually ran for Parliament again. He didn't win, but he was that kind of person. So on to our kind of third part. Now, I have to apologise so far because I haven't really delivered a villain. I haven't really delivered a Hollywood quality style villain. I mean, I read an article, to be a proper Hollywood villain, you've got to be English, you've got to be aristocratic, you've got to be a politician or a banker, and unfortunately the people I mentioned before really fit the bill. I mean, Alexander Fordyce was Scottish originally, Peter Minuet was Dutch, but this one really hits all the kind of Hollywood, ticks all the Hollywood boxes. It's a guy called William Dewar. He was born in 1743. He was a son of a plantation owner. He studied, went to school at Eton, so you can see he was an aristocratic Englishman with probably dubious origins. And after finishing his time at Eton, his parents think he should go into the army, but they don't want him to actually, end up getting killed. So they make him the aide-de-camp kind of secretary to Clive of India. So he goes to Clive of India for 3 years to India, but unfortunately the Clive doesn't really agree with him, and so he gets sick and he's sent back to England. For a few years after that, his father dies, and he inherits a plantation in the West Indies. However, he's quite a adventurous person. As part of his plantation, he trades lumber with New York. He goes to New York, and he's convinced that New York is a place to be. And so he sells his plantation, he starts buying huge amounts of land in New York and becomes a prominent local figure. And initially, a few years after that, of course, the War of Independence breaks out. And initially, William Dewar kind of sits on the fence, tries to stay neutral, then he realises that actually the Americans are probably going to win, so he decides to throw his lot in with the American cause. In fact, he serves in the Continental Congress, which plays an important role in the Declaration of Independence. But he doesn't actually do anything as vulgar as actually fight. He actually decides to make his fortune selling arms to the Americans. So he makes another fortune as an arms dealer, but he does actually eventually marry the daughter of an American general. So I guess he helps the war efforts in that way. Anyway, 1789, America is now independent. America kind of needs its own government. It needs a sort of President George Washington. It's got a Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. It's also got a Secretary of Treasury called Alexander Hamilton. You might have heard of him. Someone's writing a musical maybe about him. But Alexander Hamilton needs an assistant. And so who does he decide on? He decides on William Dewar. He appoints an assistant secretary of the Treasury. The fact that he's the business partner of Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law, Philip Schuyler, absolutely plays no role in it at all. Unfortunately, this proves to be a promotion too far for Dewar. Even while he's Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, he gets involved in various scams and scandals. The first of this is known as the Scioto Gang Company. Now, in 1782, 1783, America signs a treaty with Paris giving a huge amount of land in modern-day Ohio. His idea was to buy the land from the Ohio Gang Company and sell it on to French aristocrats fleeing the Revolution. Unfortunately, when the French aristocrats who had bought the land arriving in Ohio, they found that actually William Dewar didn't bother actually paying for the land, so their title, of course, is worthless. It creates a massive scandal, which would have been a massive scandal had not been involved in another more important scandal. This time, Alexander Hamilton, if you've ever seen the musical, he's a big fan of America having its own central bank, rather like the Bank of England. And like the Bank of England is going to be a private kind of bank owned by shareholders. Alexander Hamilton decides, comes up with this kind of quirk. To buy shares in the Bank of the United States, you not only have to pay cash, but you also have to give in a certain amount of US debt, the idea of consolidating all the debt in one institution. And William Dewar thinks, well, actually, everyone's going to have to buy American debt to buy shares in the Bank of the United States. My idea is I'm going to make a huge bet on make a huge bet on US bonds rising. So he decides, he convinces himself, he uses fortune back of his business partners to actually speculate on US debt. But unfortunately, after initial surge, US debt starts to fall down. And William Dewar's gains start to turn into losses. But of course, like all good financial gambler, William Dewar doubles and triples down on his investment. He starts to actually borrow huge sums of money. First, he borrows large sums of money at a relatively low interest rate. Next, as his losses go even higher, he borrows small amounts of money at higher interest rates. Then eventually, he's actually reduced to borrowing money on a kind of Ponzi scheme, give me your money, I'll pay you double back next week basis, from shopkeepers, widows, orphans, butchers, craftsmen, gardeners, market women, and the noted lord, Mrs. McCartney. And eventually his empire collapses in early 1792. He's thrown in debtor's prison, and he actually spends the next 7 years until he dies in jail. However, this creates a huge kind of financial panic, and early Solomon Alexander Hamilton steps in and organises the first bailout of many. But this plays an important part in American history because a group of brokers and stock jobbers in New York get together and say, the problem with this William Dewar's action, William Dewar's fraud, is a gap in a centralised stock exchange. If we can centralise all the stock exchange in New York together and have all stocks and bond transactions take place in one place, we can actually eliminate fraud. Because obviously there's never been a fraud since the creation of the New York Stock Exchange. Anyway, in 1792 they agree what's known as the Buttonwood Agreement, which forms the New York Stock Exchange, which is even today the largest stock exchange in the world. So that's actually how an old Etonian led to the creation of Wall Street. Now, now you might have heard of Henry Kissinger's famous quote. He once said, actually, to be a proper country, you need your own currency, your own army, and your own football team. But I would disagree. I think the important thing for a country is you really need a good frenemy. A country you have close relations with, but also you can't that you almost secretly kind of hate. And I think it has to be a country that's very close to you. And of course, for America, someone may say America and Britain have really kind of formed that idea of being divided by a common language. But actually, I would say the best example would be America and Canada. Now, it's very easy for many people to confuse America and Canada, but I wouldn't advise you doing that, especially if there was a hockey smith nearby. And believe me, I've learned that the hard way. The first time America and Canada kind of went to war was the War of 1812, where America tried to invade what was then British North America, and vice versa. It ended up in a kind of stalemate, and with the White House actually being burnt down and destroyed. But actually, the tensions between America and Canada would flare up after the US Civil War. because there was this idea, immediately after the US Civil War, they had the idea of manifest destiny. And the idea of manifest destiny was, America had a very brutal and bloody civil war. The best way to bring the country north and south together is by trying to take bits of other countries and expand. So you had America in 1867 buying Alaska, or would be known as Suez Folly, where America would gain a large amount of natural resources, lots of sunny scenery, and unfortunately also Sarah Pagan a few years ago. After that, actually, the same year, Canada would actually would pass the Articles of Confederation of Canada, the first step to becoming an independent country. But there were still attempts by America to actually buy Canada, and there would be one instance where they actually went to war again. As I understand, there's a bit of background. The second half of the 19th century was known as the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age, there was the railroads, there was electricity, there were lots of inventions, and this created a huge amount of economic growth in America. But a lot of economic growth accrued to a relatively few number of people, a few number of tycoons, a few number of Wall Street financiers. And so it was known as the Gilded Age, because it was basically like a succession, but with much bigger yachts. Now I want to ask a quick question. Who's heard of Leonard Jerome? At all, anyone? Okay, who's heard of his grandson, Winston Spencer Churchill? That kind of gives you an indication. These tycoons who are known as the robber barons wanted to become real barons. And when they couldn't become actual barons, they could marry their daughters for one. Hence the case of the Leonard Jerome's daughter married Randolph Churchill, and of course one of their sons being Winston Churchill. In fact, you could say, in my previous talk, I said you're not a proper British aristocrat unless you've got an illegitimate son of Charles II somewhere in your family tree. Well, I would actually say now you're actually not a proper British aristocrat if you don't have an illegitimate son of Charles II in one branch and a Wall Street robber baron on the other. And it wasn't actually all one way. In fact, British investors were actually the biggest single international investors in America, in America's shares. In fact, right up until 1914, a large chunk of the US stock market was owned by British people. In fact, when war was declared in August 1914, they had to shut down the stock market, American stock market, for several weeks, because all the British aristocrats were selling their shares in order to raise money for the war effort. So, and this combination of aristocrats and American robber barons came together in what was known as the case of Lord Gordon and Jay Gould. Now, Jay Gould was a quintessential American robber baron. He started out in business as a tanner. He swindled the tannery of his business partner, and then after the US Civil War, he made his fortune what would become known as Black Friday, where he nearly caused the US government to collapse by speculating in gold. And he spent a lot of his career trying to win control of one railroad in particular called the Erie. And the Erie Railroad was a really important railroad because it linked the industrial northeast of America with the American Midwest, where the food was produced. So people would ship goods from the American northeast, and then they would ship corn and grain from the American Midwest. The problem was Jay Gould couldn't quite get control of the area. In 1872, his business partner, Jim Fisk, was shot by the husband of the woman he was having an affair with, and so Jay Gould's chance of getting the Erie seemed slim. One day, Jay Gould was in a hotel when a man came up to him and said, "I'm Lord Gordon, I'm the agent for the wealthy Campbell family. We control most of the Erie shares. They're happy to throw their shares behind you to gain control of the railroad, but you had to give me $1 million in shares and bonds. And J. Gould was pretty desperate, so he actually gave this person, Lord Gordon, $1 million worth of shares and bonds. The problem was, rather than helping him win control of the railroad, he quickly heard this Lord Gordon was selling the shares and simply pocketing the money. So he hired a private detective and he arranged eventually for the police to arrest Lord Gordon. The problem was Lord Gordon didn't give up. He said, I am actually a real British lord, honest, he arranged to get bail, and immediately, as soon as he got bail, he fled to Canada northwards. This didn't sit well with J. Gould. Lord Gordon still had roughly half of J. Gould's money. So J. Gould asked the British authorities, could you please extradite this con man so he can stand trial in America? And the Canadians and the Brits said, absolutely not. This person, the British citizen, why should we have him stand trial in such a barbarous country as America? And J. Gould was really angry, and so he decided he'd hired a posse of Wild West cowboys. The idea was that the posse would come up, go to Canada, grab Lord Gordon, and bring him back to America to stand trial. And this nearly actually worked. They got to Canada, they found Gordon, they kidnapped him, and they were within 100 yards of the US-Canada border before they were stopped. And not only were they stopped, they were actually thrown in prison themselves. And this turned what would have been a dispute between two people into a major international incident. And you actually had your telegrams in the White House, Downing Street, you actually had the governor of Minnesota in America said, screw diplomacy, get a militia and let's invade Canada. And he actually raised an army of 5,000 people. And the idea was they'd go into Canada, they'd invade Canada, they'd then free the captured kind of posse, and presumably, I guess, once they were there, they'd probably stay there. There was a major international incident, and then I said before, there were letters between Downing Street, between the White House. Would this end in war? Would this lead to another war of 1812? But actually, disappointingly enough, at this point, a group of a jeweler from London actually came up, sailed up to America and said, hang on, we know this guy is no British aristocrat, he's a con man, he's really conned £10,000 worth of jewels from us before he left for America. And suddenly the British authorities and the Canadian authorities saying, actually, you can have him, we don't really want this con man. And Gordon, being an obliging chap, spared the need for a trial by shooting himself. So actually, and as we know, America and Canada are two completely independent countries, which are, of course, to this day, living harmoniously. And of course, the President of the United States, of course, he isn't calling the Prime Minister of Canada governor or threatening with 30% tariffs now, is he? Anyway, so that's basically how America gained a free enemy in Canada, which leads me on very nicely with Donald Trump and his tweets to really how the Wolf of Wall Street broke the internet. Now, you probably agree, a lot of people are dissatisfied with the internet. They think there's disinformation, hate, and of course people trying to promote shows about how to see a billion on Facebook. So who's to blame for this? Is it for Mark Zuckerberg? Is it Donald Trump? Is it Kim Kardashian for the photo that broke the internet? Or indeed, but actually, I think the real person who broke it is a guy called Jordan Belfort. You probably know Jordan Belfort as a guy called The Wolf of Wall Street, not least because there was a very successful film that grossed $400 million called The Wolf of Wall Street. And in fact, there's actually been several books. There's been The Wolf of Wall Street, Catching the Wolf of Wall Street, and The Wolf of Wall Street on Investing. So actually, there's a book on investing in essence by the Wolf of Wall Street, a guy convicted of fraud. Actually, it's surprisingly readable. But what more can I tell you that wasn't covered in the film? Well, one thing, the film actually brought down the Malaysian government. It turned out that the Martin Scorsese film was actually funded by someone who embezzled money, a guy called Joe Rogan, who's currently still at large, who embezzled money, and a lot of celebrities had, Leonardo DiCaprio had to actually return gifts that Joe Rogan had given them, which proves to you that even the sharks of Hollywood are no match for Wall Street and crooked financiers. Anyway, so Jordan Belfort, who was born in 1962, he initially started out selling meat and ice cream and fish door to door. He then took a step down in life and became a stockbroker with Rothschild. Unfortunately, very soon after he joins, there's a October 1987 panic on Wall Street. Stocks fall 20% in a day. And Rothschild goes bankrupt. Jordan Belfort is out on the street. He's developed a taste for the high life, so he decides to join what is known as a boiler room. A boiler room is basically we have double glazing sales from the financial world. They're basically a group of stockbrokers who sell either non-existent or fraudulent shares using high-pressure sales tactics to people with just a little bit of money. His big breakthrough was that actually rather than trying to sell penny shares to people with a few $1,000s, you could actually make a lot more money with pretty much the same amount of effort by selling penny shares to people with tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. And in fact, his company he sets up a brokerage called Stratton Oakmont. He buys it out, and actually, even when the fraud is revealed by Forbes magazine, they call him the Christian Robin Hood, robbing the rich to feed himself and his merry band of brokers. And the week after it is published, there's a line around the block at Stratton Oakmont. Not people wanting their money back, people who want to work for Stratton Oakmont and get a piece of it action. And eventually he's brought to justice. They convict him on 31 counts of wire fraud. They estimate he sold about $1 billion worth of dodgy shares, and he gets how many years? He gets 2 years in prison, which obviously shows you how tough America is on white-collar criminals. At least they didn't elect him president. But I can't say he'd be any worse than the current person in the White House. Anyway, and even though he gets ordered to pay back about $110 million worth in restitution, of which he's paid back about $15 million. So he's and so how did he break the internet? Well, in 1994, the internet is really in its infancy. We don't have Twitter, we don't have Facebook, we have what's known as bulletin boards. So we have bulletin boards where you can post about various topics. One of these bulletin boards, people are discussing one day Stratton Oakmont. So one person says, posts a message saying, should I invest with them? Another person says, don't, they're a bunch of crooks, don't touch them with a barge pole. And Stratton Oakmont sues. They don't just sue the person who posts, they sue the internet company that hosted the website. Now, a lot of people think, that the case failed because they couldn't really get that suing, BT for crimes committed over the phone. Actually, shockingly enough, Stratton Oakmont are quite clever. They actually looked through the terms and conditions, and they noticed that the internet hosting company say we're not going to host sites that promote violence or adult stuff. This was really the infancy of the internet. Anyway, they say if you're not going to host certain websites, in fact you're choosing to host this website means in effect you make a conscious decision to host it, which means you are in effect the publisher of that website. and therefore liable for anything people say. And amazingly, they actually win the case, even though, of course, as we know later on, it was a fraud. And it has caused panic in the internet community, because if internet hosting companies are going to be held liable for the stuff they host, the internet, as we know, it really isn't going to exist. But at this time, there's an attempt in America to try and clean up the internet, a bit like today's Online Safety Act. And the internet companies say, fine, we're happy you to try and clean the internet, honest gov, but we can't do that every time we try and refuse to host websites. We get sued for the websites we don't that we do choose to host. And so, as part of the Communication Decency Act, we have what's known as Section 230. And this basically says that the companies that host the internet, host forums, host discussion boards, are not liable for content people put up. And this basically, a year later, the Communication Decency Act, the censorship part, was struck down, but Section 230 remains. And this Section 230 really is a cornerstone of the internet. Some would say it's internet's original sin. It means that Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, basically, up until very recently, can post pretty much have anything, and they're not actually liable for it, which really enables Twitter, enables social media, and obviously enables things like the rise of Donald Trump. So that's really how Jordan Belfort and how that lawsuit get to the breaking of the internet. Now, I want to say thank you for coming to see this show. It's really great to see everyone. This is the only performance of the show, but obviously I have hopes to take it further, so please do leave a review if you liked it. If you don't like it, blame Jordan Belfort. Anyway, thank you for coming. This show is free, but lawyers aren't. So if you want to leave money in the bucket, that would be really great. Also, a big thanks to Brewdog for hosting the show, and thanks for coming to see.